It's not often a comic book legend agrees with me, so I'm definitely going to talk about it right now. Grant Morrison, if you don't check out his Substack, it's got a ton of good information. He's one of the creators out there that has the Substack newsletters that is willing to kind of really let loose and tell you what was going on with the comic books, how it was affecting him, and what his thoughts were as these things were going on. Previously, Grant Morrison has told us how Dan Didio planned to turn Clark Kent Superman into an alt-right type of character. He's also gone into a lot of the stuff that was going on with 5G and some of the issues with that and why everything kind of worked out the way it did in the end. This week, Grant Morrison went in and started talking about Multiversity, a work he did almost a decade ago, kind of cataloging the different multiverses and what made them unique within the DC Comics universe. And it turns out I'm not the only one that says Grant Morrison is the only person that should be working on Earth 11, or really a lot of these Earths that are out there. Grant Morrison agrees with me. Grant Morrison believes he's the only person that should be working on a lot of these things, because a lot of times DC Comics aren't going to use them for good purposes. They're going to use them for their own gain in kind of weird ways. I'll kind of get into that here. A lot of this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I'm definitely going to go through it and give you my thoughts on what Grant Morrison is saying here, how he agrees with me. He says I'm right, because I said only Grant Morrison should be doing Earth 11. Danny Lore shouldn't be touching any of that stuff. I even got pushback from some of the viewers saying everybody should work on Earth 11. Grant Morrison created Earth 11, and he agrees with me. Now let's get into what he had to say on Substack. We've got some interesting stuff. He also throws some shade at Dark Crisis, which I thought was funny. Grant Morrison says, I'm quite protective of my Multiversity work, and I get about as riled as I can get about these things nowadays when other creators choose to artificially raise the stakes in their stories by destroying characters and concepts before they even get a chance to be explored. How can I ever forgive my former Batman editor and pal Peter Tomasi for killing Red Racer, the gay Flash of Earth 36, thereby destroying his relationship with the Flashlight, that world's version of Green Lantern, and killing a newly created queer character for no defensible reason. Red Racer's place on the multiversal justice incarnate has now been claimed by the non-binary Kid Quick. It's good to see that I'm not the only one that's protective of the Multiversity work that Grant Morrison did. You would hope DC Comics would be more protective of it as well. Obviously, he talks kind of about how they killed off Red Racer, just as kind of a publicity stunt. You take these characters, you never fully flesh them out, you don't really explore them, but you get a major death and you can sell the comic book kind of that way. A lot of this is tongue-in-cheek, but it seems like Grant Morrison is being pretty serious about protecting his work, and I don't blame him. There's a lot of effort going on in comic books right now to essentially erase the past, the accomplishments of other creators, because they would like to rewrite the narrative of what the comic book industry is and what it has been. A lot of people would like you to believe that there were no trans creators in comic books until the last 5 years or so, which spits directly in the face of someone like Rachel Pollack, who is an open trans woman that was creating comic books at DC out in the open as a trans creator. I know there are multiple artists also working at DC Comics at the time that were trans as well, because the comic book industry has always been pretty accepting of different people within their ecosphere. A lot of people would like you to forget that. So you go out there and maybe you kill some of the things that a Grant Morrison created so you can bring somebody else in and create a Kid Quick. So you can claim that you had the first non-binary Flash, even though you had to kill off a queer character to get there. And quite frankly, Grant Morrison is pretty smart to be apprehensive about what DC Comics are doing and a lot of what their motivations are. Grant Morrison was on the forefront on creating LGBTQ plus characters. He's created trans characters. He's created a lot of queer characters back in the day and certainly up through his time at DC Comics. That's not good for the narrative. And they're going to go out of their way to go out there and try to destroy the things that he created, destroy the legacies of people like a Rachel Pollack, because it doesn't fit into the narrative. The only people that have ever been brought in that were part of these groups are your Vita Ayalas and your Danny Lores and your T. Franklins and whatnot. And it just isn't the truth. The comic book industry itself has been accommodating, accepting for a lot of groups that weren't openly accepted in society. But those truths being out there, and somebody like a Grant Morrison who's created all these things, they go against that narrative. So I don't begrudge Grant Morrison thinking this way, because I agree with it. I think they're absolutely going to go out there and try and destroy his work. And they're going to bring in the least talented people possible that fill the right demographics so they can say that they did it for the first time and kind of take away Grant Morrison's legacy. He does throw some shade at Dark Crisis. I thought this was funny, but I definitely want to cover this part too. In my view, the general rule of thumb is that each of these alternate worlds should be treated as its own potential franchise rather than squandered as disposable cannon fodder for the 19th nervous rerun of Crisis on Infinite Earths. The major comics universe in Earth 8, for instance, should reflect the actual Marvel universe, which is to say, don't do anything to American Crusader or the Bug that would be squashed by editorial if you submitted your plot to the editors of Captain America or Spider-Man. You can do the death of American Crusader, but only if you have an Ed Brubaker-style story designed to explore what that means and devised to bring him back in style when the time comes. I really like that little shade when he talks about like the 18th rerun of Crisis on Infinite Earths. They keep going back to the well unsuccessfully on these Crisis events. Eventually the luster wears off, and they're really having to really remind you, DC Comics, that these Crises are going to include nostalgia pieces about the Crisis that you liked in the past, because they can't really sell Dark Crisis on its own. For Dark Crisis #1, there's going to be a Jim Lee variant that celebrates, guess what? Crisis on Infinite Earths. Jim Lee sells, and they want you to remind you that this should feel like Crisis on Infinite Earths. It shouldn't feel like anything different, because if you think about this being like a modern DC comic, you might not want to read it. I don't feel right with what they're doing with the George Perez birthday tribute, turning it into a special variant for Dark Crisis #7. It just feels icky to me. You know what I mean? It's clear what they're trying to do. They're not doing it to celebrate George Perez. They're using people's appreciation and adoration for George Perez and everything he meant to comic books to sell the final issue, because they can see the writing on the wall that the sales aren't very good. We even saw that they're offering special discounts. Like if you order more issues of Dark Crisis #1 than Batman 118, I think 3 of the covers on Batman 118, probably the 3 highest selling covers, to be completely honest, like you get an extra discount, because they really want shops to buy this comic book, because the sales probably aren't as good as they anticipated, or what would be in line with like a Crisis style event. And once again, I do not blame Grant Morrison for throwing this shade here, because that's what they want to do. They want to recreate something that worked in the past. They don't want to have to do anything too drastic. They don't want to have to think too hard. So let's just remind people that they like Crisis on Infinite Earths. Let's remind people that they like this thing back from 40 years ago, and tell them that we're going to play with it again here and now. But of course, we're going to drop the ball and kind of fuck it up. I know DC is just in such a weird state. That's why I really appreciate what Grant Morrison is doing and really opening up in his Substack newsletter and kind of letting some of these details out. That's one of the reasons I really appreciate Rob Liefeld's podcast, because he just doesn't give a fuck. And I appreciate people with that kind of attitude mindset. Rob Liefeld could sell a comic book just by putting his art on the cover. So what the fuck does he care? He could say whatever he wants, because eventually Marvel and DC are going to need to sell a comic book, and they're going to have to pay him, whether they like it or not. So I appreciate what Grant is doing here, giving out this information and these opinions of his, and I definitely appreciate what Liefeld is doing. And Grant Morrison didn't just agree with me the one time, he agreed with me another time, because I said the Batwoman Who Laughs was a stupid fucking idea. Guess who agreed with me? Grant Morrison. Can't believe it. I was a little disappointed when the Batwoman of this world was transformed into the evil Batwoman Who Laughs, although I totally understood why writer Joshua Williamson, whose work I enjoy, chose to take this route, and why the notion of a Batwoman Who Laughs, based on Scott Snyder's infamously and hilariously nihilistic creation, The Batman Who Laughs, might seem too good to pass up. He continues later on in the newsletter. In the case of Earth 11 Kathy Cade, at least, I like to think there's hope for putting her back where she belongs in Earth 11 Batwoman role. The Batwoman Who Laughs should technically come from the dark multiverse, not from the orrery of worlds. So maybe there was a mix-up, and Earth 11 Batwoman is even now fighting her way back home from the dark multiverse or something. I cannot express to you how much I loathe the Batman Who Laughs. The Batwoman Who Laughs, I loathe pretty much equally, just as a stupid idea. Once again, tapping into something that was recently something that generated sales, something people like. Well, we had the Batman Who Laughs. What can we do that's similar? Let's do the Batwoman Who Laughs. That's sure to make people buy the goddamn comic book. Well, how about we come up with some original ideas? And as Grant Morrison was saying there, can't we just stay within the concepts of what DC Comics have within the framework of their goddamn multiverse? If she's the Batwoman Who Laughs, she's from the dark multiverse, which doesn't include Earth 11. Geniuses. You can't even follow your own goddamn rules. The one thing I'm really happy about, because I know Scott Snyder was going for this when he did Dark Knight's Death Metal, that King Robin King, where that fucking stupid character was going to be the next Batman Who Laughs, the next totally metal creation of Scott Snyder, where he sit at a lunch table with Greg Capullo and they talk about all the stupidest ideas they could come up with without actually trying to think of anything interesting. I imagine we will see King Robin King, whatever the fuck the name of that character is, eventually somewhere, probably from Joshua Williamson, because he's definitely recycling all the scraps from Scott Snyder that he can. See also Dark Crisis. But I'm just glad that they didn't come out with a miniseries on that one. And then Dark Knight's rap metal didn't end up with King Robin as the fucking big villain that stole the brain from fucking Dr. Manhattan and became the most evil, uncontainable villain in the history of the goddamn DC universe. You guys have no idea. Like, I have to censor myself, and I can't really express to you how much I hate those concepts in and of themselves. The Batman Who Laughs didn't have to be one of the things I truly hate in comic books, but they overexposed the character so fast and made him so goddamn powerful that he was beyond obnoxious and eminently hateable. And I could see the same thing was going to happen with Robin King. Thankfully, it never happened, and that fucking character is sitting on the sidelines where he belongs, because I've had enough fucking totally awesome metal characters that I could think of in a goddamn gymnasium with my buddies when I was 11 years old. Hopefully you can read between the lines and really understand. I am not joking, but I fucking say I hate that character. I really dislike the Batman Who Laughs, and I definitely dislike the Batwoman Who Laughs. I'm glad Grant Morrison agrees with me and says that that character is an abomination. These aren't the only opinions that Grant Morrison has expressed on his Substack. He did talk about the time Dan Didio wanted to turn Clark Kent Superman into an alt-right character, and he essentially had to save Clark Kent Superman from Dan Didio. Obviously, he didn't fully save him because the character is exiled in Warworld, but this is an interesting video, and you definitely get some interesting behind-the-scenes information from Grant Morrison.